So versioning of Bob Cobbing's work. Arguments over the status of Bob Cobbing's work as poetry, and then how to categorize his work as poetry, tend to distract from engagement with the poem's contributions to radical ways of rethinking the fundamental ontology of art. One of the things that Cobbing you always get is people look at it and the first thing they say is, that's poetry? And it's amazing he is one of those poets that still has that effect. Cobbing spoke of family resemblances. There's a lot of Wittgenstein floating around this conference. Family resemblances that exist between different instances and variations of the poem. Just as importantly, by pointing to the different versions that the poem is, the poet is arguing for the crucial role that a relative autonomy from a dependence on what we usually consider an actual event has to play in linguistic innovation. My somewhat pedantic shop talk here, if it can be forgiven, will include much unfamiliar language and some fancy terms that take up the kind of jargon that was produced in this decade where subjectivist forms of post-structuralism were in ascendancy. So let's begin by posing the question of the ontological difference of transcriptional or recitative versions of the copy. Each recitation and each retranscription, including significantly new printing, will recode the poem. It's rather like the way each performance of a musical piece recodes whatever set of recodings stand in the field of attention that organizes the new composition. Thus, the term original composition is no longer especially useful. And note how this resonates with 80s post-structuralist ideas that are steeped in German idealism and coming out of a lot of that tradition of ideas of like the groundless ground or the originless origin. It's all over Derrida, you'll find it. Arguably, since the material object, in other words, the original poem, cannot precisely be called a text, then Cobbing's copies achieve an equality of value based on their material rather than their textual nature. I say arguably because many of Cobbing's poems can be edited as text and reproduced as material or facsimile. So I don't see a particularly useful distinction between the material object that is the print or copy and the material object. In other words, the poem that was copied or original that was duplicated. I'll go on to explain this. It'll become a little bit clearer. And it seems perhaps pedantic to insist on the difference, even though it is an area, as we shall see, that's very rich for theoretical speculation. And I'm just getting into this, just a little taster. Jerome McGann, who works in my field of British Romanticism, once distinguished the text, or the poem as a purely linguistic event, so text, purely linguistic event, from the version, material constitutions, or the immediate and integral physical object through which the text is being executed. Text, purely linguistic event, version, material constitutions, and then he also makes a further distinction of text, version from the work, and work's a little easier to understand. It's the more, it's the global constitution, so it has that wider, general writing activity in general. But this ontological situation we're already seeing more complex as we turn to Cobbing's materials. It's going to get more complicated. In 1988, Cobbing published an essay with the revealing title, Changing Forms in English Visual Poetry, The Influence of Tools and Machines. And there's an intended pun here that gives both an imperative emphasis and an adjectival status to changing forms. The technical and other notes section at the back of the book, Voice Prints, lists the following poet's provisions: color monotypes, tools, positive and negative stencils, rubber roller, toothpick, fork, etc., duplicator prints, Canon photocopier, tools, found material, Sinclair QL computer, photographs. And you can see here, if you know Cobbing's work, that's very incomplete in regards to what tools he's actually using. Note that there is already a micro version implied in the work in the type-strax foregrounding of the difference between the performance of the setting of type and the imprint on the page. When I first met Bob, he was still, he would give readings and he would say, perform this, and you'd be reading this, and this would be your score, and you'd base this off, that's your score. And this raises important questions, I think, of sound environment, especially, but also the idea of what is a type, and types of found scores. One of the big influences, obviously, is Kurt Schwitters, who, of course, had been in London decades before. The story of Cobbing's introduction to tools and machines is often told, but I think it bears repeating in this context. In the 1960s, Cobbing began using the dry transfer method of applying lettering in a variety of typefaces, when he fortunately found cracked, discarded sheets of Letraset type in a dustbin. It was the broken letters on these sheets that sparked a lifelong interest in creating images that fracture, vary, and modify the word itself. While working as a hospital clerk during World War II, he discovered a Orono duplicating machine in the storeroom, prompting his first forays into the visual poetry world. And I think this is as important as Whitman working as a nurse, or Freud doing his studies during the war to develop the technology of trauma theory. In the poetry world, this is important. One can speculate that part of the decision to move away from phonetic to visual poems is the great demands the former makes on the reader to produce a version faithful enough to the notated page. And I think that's something that really interested Bob, is the idea of what's considered unfaithful enough. It can also be observed in this slide that Cobbing gradually dropped the inclusion of instructions and pronunciation guides in favor of unadulterated textual provocation. You know, you look at the old sound poetry now, and there's all what seems really hokey to us now, the instructions to tell you how to read it. Now, sound poetry rarely ever needs to do that. For example, the fourth edition of ABC in Sound came out on Writers' Forum in 1984, but it was performed in many, many new versions throughout the mid-'80s. There was the New River project, where a lot of the work in the '80s, I'll get into it, but there's lots of different versions of the same poem being performed. Once it goes into performance, it can come back to a text. Once it's been a text, who knows where it can go, and I'll discuss that a bit later. So the fourth edition of ABC in Sound, it still introduces itself with a statement, quote, "The rhythms and patterns of sound may be discovered from the poems themselves, but a few indications may help." And then it follows this, the new revised edition follows this with an additional sentence, quote, "The above notes were written in 1964, since when a certain freedom of performance has emerged, thus making for flexibility in interpretation." In a decade of stadium rock and everything big, Cobbing preferred the intimate setting of public houses and very small publications and thin publications. I think as a way to nurture this communal flexibility of interpretation, comfortably hidden from all the larger publishing houses of London. In a style mastered by the '80s, creases act as caresses for, quote, "rhythm and patterns of sound, worked through the concoction of printing machine jams and kisses to its rude mechanical parts, or by further complicating the relationship to the ink duplicator stencil." Comes a key tool for him is that duplicator stencil. Each print promises its own unique performance as an adaptation that permits a flexibility of performance and renewed opportunities for spontaneous human-machine composition. Kind of chimes with the Donna Haraway cyborg stuff that's happening in the '80s and got people on hiring committees very excited in the '80s. A rental Canon photocopier changed the speed and modality of production from the rich tone and intense black of a Gestetner ink on absorbent paper to more detailed and instantaneous images that are often the result of reproduced objects and handwriting. This allowed Cobbing to focus greater attention on the fact that each generation the printed text went through on the analog copier had it welcomed this completely unpredictable noise, and therefore that creates a significantly new text. Alan Fisher's Fool's House from 1982 uses this method of accidental overlay on similar papers, but there is a background to and is interference with other texts that are printed on top, kind of palimpsest. The found status of many poems' material complicates or perhaps complements the idea of versions. Cobbing's prolific nature entailed letting available technology loose on a wide range of available material, correspondence, advertisements, etc. In architecture, versioning, architecture I think is important because it is postmodern theory in the '80s, it's coming out of that architectural theory. Versioning in architecture is an operative term meant to describe a recent significant shift in the way technology is used to expand the potential effects of design on our world. Cobbing's work, I would argue, still promises similar minor paradigmatic shifts in the world of poetry. The poet's intentional use of parasitism or parasitation, as well as simply hanging out with and happening upon previous experiments, and fugitive pages, keyword for him, fugitive pages, leads to a recognition of alternative and shifting frames available for the recontextualization of poems. Links are forged from single poems to larger textual constellations. The poem and reader, performer, listener are left to wander in hyperspace. One poem from 1966 bears the amusing title "Back to the Drawer Board," and consists of 2 panels that appear to be the poet's working materials. It's some kind of writing implement, a pad or a pile of sketch paper, and just the faintest impression that the work has begun. In a similar vein, Clippings from 1987 features a rich texture of what could be shredded paper or paper waste arranged into nest-like dimensions, or a much-abused wig. It could just be a wig. Cobbing's final publication for Writers' Forum in the 80s, a period-specific piece commenting on the poet's sightings called Self-Portrait with Glasses. One reads clothing in the gorgeous, playful gouge and scrim of knicker twists. It's from 1987. Cobbing's interest in mathematical computations and number patterns in the early permutation poems leads sensibly to the employment of cheap computer graphics, and his striking photo montage poems are represented in the collection Bill Dubois, which covers the period just before the photocopying becomes the main thing and then moves on. I'm going to skip some stuff for the sake of time. Each live performance is a first appropriation by the poet of the sound becoming pronounced on its first occurrence as itself. That is, while the poem is iterable and unrepeatable in the singularity of its performance, it may be said to have a mode of being beyond its performed instances. There's so much you can say about performance and versions, and I'll try not to get too much into that. But the text and the performance actualize a virtual poem object, and they do not strictly resemble one another. They might even be said to share some rules and codes for transforming one into another, in a kind of loose kinship structure that Cobbing was keen to foster on every social level. Particularly in the dark days of Thatcherite reconservatism. With rare generosity, Cobbing had no aversion of promoting a process of production that struggles with reversion. As a virtuality, the poem is fleeting, can be revisited through versioning. I think revisiting is a term he likes a lot. Versioning comes to appear as a practical matter, a form of accomplishment rather than a form of truth. It has to be carried out or copied out. ABC Revisited, now this is the handout, so I'll deal with this and we can finish. ABC Revisited, published in the volume of selected work called Cobbok, is a remake, which is still something of a rare occurrence in 80s Hollywood cinema. Now we're plagued with it. It's a remake of ABC in sound, which you can find online, lots of recordings of if you're interested. And the spatial intuition of the title immediately accents its variability. ABC Revisited. It's a revisitation of ABC in sound. Taken on its own, each poem offers a plurality of effect resulting from different relations that its singular gesture may create. So each poem I see is a singular gesture. It may be usefully seen as an action poem. Think of action paintings. Here we've got an action poem. Action printing, in fact, is the name that Robert Shepard gives to, quote, moving material on the copyboard as the print is made. So you're making the print, but you're manipulating it as you're moving it. Yeah, I can skip this. So let's call it an action poem, with its cascading drips superficially similar to abstract expressionist canvases. Bob used to do abstract expressionist paintings himself before moving into poetry. So even the most abstract visual poems often include an oblique reference to the fact that these are sound texts, whether it be a bare bones of a letter showing through the dark matter, or a pun on some aspect of orality. Like many other works, the text recalls at a first glance starfield maps, or cell activity under the microscope. Peter Middleton's wonderful talk yesterday had me thinking about he mentioned libraries of DNA created in the 80s, which is useful to think about this idea of versions. So they can look like these cell structures. It's almost as if the poet were exploring uncharted territory held immanent within the original work and produced by the ghostly revisit. Actually, the secretary, when I was printing these out at the English building here, said it looked like a dance. She's like, I don't know what this is. I got the classic response, is this a poem? It looks like a dance, which is actually really relevant because I wish there were more time to talk about the influence of Jennifer Pike, Bob Cobbing's wife, who has a hand and a foot in all of his work. I mean, she would dance to these scores, often with a shroud over her head in the group Birdyak, who were fantastic. It should be clear that the versions are not developmental in the sense of advancing the original, but each may be seen as a singular gesture. Having moved from the painter's palette to the toner's vectors of possible moods, the poet returns here to a kind of abstract action that characterizes his early paintings, with a renewed sensitivity for the drip as an articulation of time. And pay attention, because I'm going to give an awful close reading here. So, between the two relatively stable alphas, beginnings with no ends, those A's on the left-hand side, possible decipherings of the illegible letters include an R slaking to form an N with an opening on its right side, and an O stretched to an D, or a D whose stomach is expanded to show the embryonic form inside. One can drift around the ink, seeking visual or sonic gesturts, or follow its momentum. You can find proto-letters in the root-like shapes and smears. Bob also used to perform trees. He loved like vegetable matter, so a tree, you can imagine, it's a beautiful way to read a score. That's lovely. So you see these kind of root-like shapes appear often. Greater density of print may cause one to increase the volume of one's reading by comparison to the white gulfs and eddies. And certain kinds of slurring sounds seem to be welcomed by the long, the daubs and the smudges that could produce a loud howl when they occasionally connect. Bob used to howl like a gibbon, it's fantastic. The spilled liquid demands a very physical engagement between one's psyche and the page, recommending labile blather and nasal yelps, perhaps as though one were sucking on a satisfying teat-like shape or licking up the domestic ambient mess the poet has left behind. The gradual descent down the page invites a shift to the fundamental low frequencies of the vocal cord. The bottom of the page, though probably a semi-conscious product of accident since it's a drip, so there is no control, perhaps not very little control when you get to the end of the page, gestures towards previous hieroglyphic experiments in Bob's work, suggesting elemental icons such as a fish or a moon or human figures and their tools. With a closer view, the blobs do indeed lend themselves to lexicommatic and morphological characteristics. It's very similar to what James Joyce called the aleph bed, that has two L's in it, in its molten state. The quote from Finnegan's here is just great because it's from Finnegan's. Parentheses, stoop, if you are ABC-minded to this clay book, what curos of signs, parentheses, please stop in this aleph bed, two L's. Can you read, parentheses, since we and thou had it out already, its world? It is the same told of all, Olives, Beets, Kimmels, Dollies, Afrids, Beaties, Cormacs, and Dortons. This is a poem, back to Cobbing, this is a poem whose beginnings are in a double A, yet whose translation into sound is haunted by the childlike, unarticulate B and O produced by dabs and rounded forms. You know, the ink at the bottom on the left, there starts to look like B's and O's as well, but you're not sure. I mean, it may be letters, we're not sure. The irregular grouping of globular blobs call for a narrow orbit of the mouth as it bounds down the blusterous page, and becomes personified in the bloated sounds produced by moistened lip percussion with minimal breath intake, low sputtering, and vomitive whoops of restricted air from the back of the throat. I should just skip a whole bunch of this and then we can finish. So there's some more, what follows is some more theory on versioning, but I think you get the gist of it, so I'll just skip on ahead. Cobbing's major work of the 1980s is the processual project. Process, I keep hearing at this conference, that really was a key term for the 80s as well. Yeah. So the processual project, it was published as some kind of collected version by the New River Project in 1987. I don't think it's really been collected though, like a lot of this stuff. Processual 1, Christmas Day, that's the name of one of the books. It was published on the 27th of December 1982. It's dedicated to Alan Fisher, who, recall, was working on his complimentary Fool's House at the time. Is offered as, quote, parentheses, almost random snippets from works in progress, given the precise date 30th of July 1982. Remember, it's called Christmas Day. It's about as far from Christmas as you can get, which I think asks the reader to imagine the time of progress between snippets and an eventual version. The author's note that follows is also intriguing in light of its appearance near the start of what was Bob's largest project to date. Quote, deals with, quote, and I don't know if he's quoting himself here, there's no explanation. Quote, deals with, quote, what has been called necessary or processual novation in contradistinction to the voluntary conventional novation, unquote, of certain preceding works. It may be a critic, or it may be his own take on his own work that he's now quoting. In 1983, Cobbing was writing a great number of these novational processual poems, beginning with numbered books and envelopes. They were manila envelopes, and extending the series to quintet, a processual double octave, and prosexual and processual novation, the 7th assignment. I mean, where are the assignments coming from? And these were just in the following year after. Those are all 1984 titles. And then some remarkably varied spin-off books. They're actually called spin-off, which is interesting. And even though at some point there's a tongue-in-cheek summation, as if you could have a summation of this processual work. The humor really comes through that. The latter, this summation, features sperm-like sprouts crossing this long divide, which kind of predicts the latter you'll see this in domestic ambient noise. There's a lot of these creation and genetic themes, a lot of it looks like kind of DNA strands that are working through to domestic ambient noise, which after processual poems is the largest kind of Cobbing work. A lot of it's in collaboration with Lawrence Upton. The rather romantic sounding necessary novation affects a rich confusion of figure and ground, with its parallel in audio culture practiced by the emerging call for remixes and disco in the 80s and deep sonic experiments of dub. In fact, versioning had been used in the 80s by reggae musicians to refer to the borrowing of rhythms and beats. As Bruce Andrews wrote to Cobbing on September 1986, ahead of their published collaboration, both, one word, both,